Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 4. And you can see what we're going to talk about this week is right there. So I'm going to get right into that because I have quite a few slides. So let me get started here. Okay, so here's the purpose of this week. There is quite a bit of reading. I'm going to get to that in a second on the next slide. But really what I want to do here is really lay the groundwork for discussing this idea of fiscal federalism or coercion through fiscal means. And so we're going to talk about in this lecture historical precedents, I should say, limits of taxation and limits of cooperative federalism. I want us to understand the differences in some key terms. And really, I want us to get a feel for really the complexity of all this through the readings and the lecture. Because this idea of fiscal federalism really is complex. And maybe unnecessarily so, I'm not sure, but it is very complex. So finally, I'm going to have we're having a discussion this week. And so based on that, and based on your readings and this lecture, I'd like you to comment on really what you think the boundaries of fiscal federalism are and provide an example of that in your discussion. So let me just focus real quick on the readings, because if you look at Canvas, you'll see I have a lot of required readings that I have those top 4 and also a bunch of supplemental readings. So let me sort of tell you what I'm doing here this week. So on the required readings from the 2 texts, first of all, from the Conlin and Posner text, I have a couple of readings, and here's what I'd like you to think about as you go through these. So the first one, which is chapter 4, think about how these models of federalism and intergovernmental finance fit in with the current economic realities of the globalized world that we find ourselves living in. That's something to focus on in that one. Second reading is chapter 12 of that book, and it talks about block grants. So as you read that, think about block grants. I'm going to talk about various types of grants in this lecture, and the other readings refer to them as well. But think of block grants as sort of a tool of federalism, in a sense, versus categorical grants. And then in the other text, in the Stenberg and Hamilton text, I'm having you read chapter 3. And so in that one, pay attention to the list, really, with short paragraphs of the many factors that the author is talking about, Kincaid is talking about, when he's talking about all these factors that influence this fiscal relationship between the national and state governments. Just this whole list of many things to consider if you were, for example, designing a regression model of what factors affect fiscal federalism or fiscal coercion. And then the last mandatory or required reading is from Posner, which is chapter 5 of the Stenberg and Hamilton text. And I really like this reading a lot. I think it's very well written. Posner I got to meet him once before he passed away a couple of years ago. Really smart guy. He writes in this article about scarcity, really. So the first law of economics, if you will, is scarcity. And so he talks about how our budgets at really both the federal and state levels aren't unlimited, obviously, and we do have quite a deficit and debt issue at the national level, not really at the state level, because states generally are required to balance their budgets. But he talks about how this issue of scarcity is really impacting the fiscal relationship between the national and state governments. It's a great article. And so then on the supplemental, I have a whole list of articles. A couple I just want to point out. One is I have an interview that was aired on C-SPAN a couple of years ago, really right at the beginning of the current presidential administration. And so some of it is actually asking a political question about sanctuary cities. But you can kind of get past that, because what the person being interviewed is talking about, she is talking about really the relationship between the national government, the federal government, and cities, not states so much, but cities, as it comes to grants. And she has some very interesting observations. The thing I like about that website, once you click on it, you'll see that you can actually go to specific parts of it's about a 30-minute interview, but you can go to specific parts if you kind of scroll down and look a little to the left, C-SPAN has broken it up into topical areas. But listen to the first few minutes, that is prior to the call-in portion of the show, and that's really informative. And then you can kind of scroll down and look at some topical areas. The Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, they're a think tank, the CBPP, they have an article which provides really good background on grants, and I'm going to actually reference a couple of their tables in this lecture. That's a really good one for understanding and differentiating between types of grants that come from the federal government and go to states and cities. The remainder of the supplemental readings are really good for background on this whole subject. So basically what I'm talking about in the readings here is I have the required readings, and then the supplemental ones are good to scan for the most part, but really come back to for the rest of the course when we sort of talk about fiscal federalism in more specific policy areas. So that's what this week will help you with. Okay, so we all know that, our country, we had this saying, no taxation without representation, right? That's what the revolutionaries said to Great Britain, that we weren't represented in Parliament, and so therefore, how could King and Parliament tax us? And that was, causal in the revolution. But the basic problem of any government is that it has to meet the demands placed upon it by the citizens while operating within the constraints citizens put on it. So we know that citizens do demand that governments at various levels do something. That's a quote, do something, government, about this problem. Well, the act of doing something necessarily costs money, because money really is the currency, literally, that we use to affect government activity in some kind of area. So elected officials have this interesting job of balancing demands of citizens while responding to the constraints that citizens also levy upon them. So that means that we have to talk about both sides of the ledger, right? Expenditures and revenues. A budget actually is the summation of expenditures and revenues. We often talk about expenditures, that's really outlays, and we talk about revenues, and we often talk about them in isolation from each other. In fact, we organize committees that way in the state legislature. But, really a budget is both, right? They can't be separated. Alternatively, we often talk, as if one or the other is irrelevant, right? We say, well, we shouldn't have so many taxes. Okay, well, so what do you want to cut? Well, we can cut by, getting savings. We can cut by cutting fraud. We can cut by cutting abuse. And we probably can cut some government expenditure by doing those things, but that wouldn't be the bulk of government expenditure, right? And finally, taxpayers do pay many taxes. You and I pay many taxes. And that is government revenue, right? That is how the government gets its revenue, any government. But there was a study, which I footnote there at the bottom, that from Michigan State, that noted that 85% of survey respondents overstated their marginal income tax rate. So that is your federal income tax rate, which is organized along a progressive marginal system, right? So people often will quote the top of the marginal scale and say, well, I have a lot of money. I'm in the 18% rate, or we talk about corporate income tax at the 35% rate or 21% rate. Well, really, marginal taxation doesn't mean that you pay that percentage on all of your income. You only pay that on a graduated scale above certain levels, right? So people often don't understand that. And so my follow-on question to that is, do taxpayers really understand the variety of taxes they pay, like sales taxes, occupation taxes, gasoline taxes, gambling? Gambling is a tax, by the way, if you didn't know that. Personal property taxes, real property taxes, airline travel taxes. do taxpayers understand the differences in the levels of government to which they pay taxes, right? Do they understand that income tax that the state of Nebraska levies against me is different than income tax that the federal government levies against me? And really, do taxpayers even understand that playing the lottery is paying taxes? There is an ongoing argument in Nebraska by pro-gambling, pro-casino advocates who say, why can't Nebraska, just like Iowa, get casinos? We're losing out on a lot of revenue. And that's true. It might be true. Of course, gambling carries all kinds of social issues with it, but it is true that gambling produces revenue because, in fact, it is a tax. It is a tax that is allowed to be carried out by commercial operators who also make a lot of money off of people contributing to that tax. So our basic problem, and this is from the text readings, is that we live in this environment, right? And so in our environment of technology, globalization, and demographics, we sort of have a problem with our dual tax and expenditure sovereignty system to meet the challenges that we find within our environment, right? Because the challenges affect you to a certain extent no matter where you live. So if you live in Hawaii or you live in Nebraska, there are challenging issues with technology, with globalization, with demographics, with the environment. And we can't say, well, this is a Hawaii problem, this is a Nebraska problem. There are some problems like that, right? Hawaii generally doesn't worry about, tornadoes, but Nebraska generally doesn't worry about volcanoes. So there are some unique problems, but in general, we have a set of problems with certain variances that apply to all people. And so even globalization is an issue for all states, right? The movement of people, the movement of capital, the movement of manufactured products, the movement of raw materials actually has a lot more impact on a lot of people, more than people really think about. And we are currently arguing about tariffs with a lot of countries, but we're arguing a lot with China. And in fact, this argument has an impact on people in Nebraska and Iowa who grow soybeans because soybean sales are down. There's a lot of soybeans that aren't being sold right now because China doesn't want to pay the tariffs that the United States wants to, or China is applying tariffs and the United States isn't shipping, and vice versa. So these are problems that affect all of us, but we have set up under our federalist system sort of a dual tax and expenditure system that may or may not be the best for dealing with these problems. So what is this coercion problem? The coercion problem is that, as we know from looking at this for a couple of weeks, we really founded a republic that was based in dual federalism, right? Dual sovereignty, if you will, whereby a couple of different polities exercised sovereignty over the same geographic area. So the state of Virginia exercised sovereignty as the national government exercised sovereignty over the seaboard of Virginia. Well, we had distinct tax systems, as we talked about. At the federal level, the federal government concentrated a lot on tariffs, right? Well, now we really have a tax system where both the federal government and state governments really are both taxing the same set of people. And states depend on the federal government now more than ever, especially since the New Deal of the 30s and the Great Society of the 60s to get some money to do their job. So on average, around 31% of all state budgets is from federal sources. A third problem that we have in this so-called coercion problem is what I call the nationalization of the policy agenda. So that really means that federal priorities are partially funded with grants from federal sources, but federal priorities are transferred to states, right? So Medicaid is a prominent example of this because Medicaid applies to all people of the United States and every state of the United States. And so some people would say that's coercion because basically what happens is in my state, we have to provide Medicaid, but the state has to pay for half of it, right? The next problem with this coercion problem is grants aren't free money for states. They're not free money. They usually come with strings attached. So they're usually categorical, defining the category for which the money can be spent, or they're block grants to be used for specific broad purposes. So therefore, I suggest this equation that coercion equals the policy agenda plus mandates, that is what the federal government's telling you to do, plus grants, plus the mandatory price sharing. So all of this means that contrary to, whether or not the United States completely ever worked this way, contrary to the idea that the state had specific budget issues and the federal government had specific budget issues, and the state was fairly sovereign in exercising its taxation and expenditure rights. Now we have a system where the federal government actually intervenes in state operations, if you will. So just as an example of whether people understand how their taxes work, this is an example. It's actually just an example that Douglas County puts out of a tax statement, a hypothetical property tax statement for a homeowner. So in this sample, the part I have circled there are the various taxing entities that this homeowner might see that show up on their tax statement for their house. So you have a community college, you have a county bond, you have a school bond from a school district, you have a fire district in this example, you have a natural resources district in this example. So all these entities are among the 80,000 or so entities in the United States that we consider governments. That is, they have tax levying authority. And typically the tax levying authority is property tax. And so when a citizen gets their tax statement and sees that they owe $3,800 for this year, for example, for the property tax on their house, they may be inclined to say, oh, the city wants all this money, or the county wants all this money, or the school district wants all this money. In fact, it's a number of entities. The schools might have a big chunk of it, but it's a number of entities that are using the property tax to get the revenue to do the things assigned to them by the state. So dual federalism through the 1860s really, carried with it this idea that within each sphere, the state and the national government were sovereign. And that really lasted up until about the Civil War. And as we've talked about, post-Civil War, really the federal government's involvement in the economy really started to grow. And so we entered this era of cooperative federalism, right? So if cooperative federalism was the vogue in say the 50s and 60s, it actually became more competitive and conflicting in the 80s and beyond, when we saw that budgets were starting to actually come under a lot of pressure because of this. So just as a reminder, and this actually goes into Kincaid in the supplemental readings. I think we talked about this a little bit in the previous weeks. Basically, in the Constitution, and Kincaid discusses this, states really had the ability to tax any activity they wanted. The Constitution really doesn't say states can't do an income tax, states can't do a property tax, states can't do a sales tax. States really had a lot of discretion to do that. It was, on the other hand, the national government who was more constrained in taxation. The national government could only do what would be thought of as a direct tax. That's the words of the Constitution. And so it took the 16th Amendment, the income tax amendment, really, to change the historic tax base that the federal government relied on, because up through the early 1900s, most of the revenue at the federal level came from tariffs and excise taxes on goods, not on taxes that individual people paid. So the state taxation system really is now has boiled down to a few kinds of key taxes, while the federal tax system has a few other specific ones. And I'm going to get to that in a minute here. So at levels of government, here's what we see, right? We see different kinds of taxes, but sometimes we see the same form of taxation used differently. So at the national level, of all the taxes collected, 47% is personal income tax, while 34% is payroll tax. And then only about 9% is corporate income tax, and 9% is excise, estate, and others. So I said excise used to be a much more pronounced aspect of the federal tax system. And as excise taxes are still levied on things like cigarettes and alcohol, they're just not as large a percentage. But so my first two bullets there are a little bit confusing, because payroll tax is the tax you pay for Social Security and Medicare. So that tax, if you will, has a specific purpose, and that is to fund the various Social Security trust funds. So really, the bulk of taxation for general purposes, not counting Social Security and Medicare, for the national government really comes from personal income tax. So go down to the state level. 48% on average, and so this is going to vary widely by state, but 48% of taxes at the state level on average is some kind of sales tax. And this is why, and you've probably talked about this in the public budgeting class, many states were fairly slow on the uptake in levying sales tax on online sales, which surprises me, because states were so reliant on sales tax, and online sales, as we know, have led to really a sharp decline in brick and mortar retail, meaning that the states had lost their source of sales tax. So because sales tax is such a large part of the tax effort at state level, about 35% is personal income tax, and then again a small percentage is corporate income tax. 2% is property tax, and 10% all others. Now that 2% of property tax, you might think, oh, that's not true. That doesn't make sense. Switch over to the local level on the right there, the lower right. Of all the taxes collected at the local level, and this includes school districts, 73% is property tax. 73%. 17% is sales tax of some kind, and then a very small percentage on average is income tax, because a lot of city entities don't have any kind of income tax. So what you're going to see at the local level is property tax and sales tax, right? At the state level, you're going to see a lot of sales tax and income tax. And the national level, you're going to see income tax. So put that all together, and what you see for you as an individual is that we have sort of this three-legged stool of taxation, if you will, which consists of income tax, sales tax, and property tax. And you, the average taxpayer, if you're actually going to sit down and calculate your effective tax rate, those are the three things that you're actually going to try to calculate. However, in fact, most people don't do a very good job of keeping track of their retail purchases or their service purchases in which they're charged a sales tax of some kind. They could go back and do it if, for example, they paid for everything with the same credit card and you get a summary at the end of the year. You could go back and probably calculate that. But even at that, if you, for example, travel a lot on business, you're not going to know, you're going to have a hard time figuring out the occupancy taxes that you paid in other cities to stay at a hotel, which sometimes are quite high, around 15 or 16%. And so it's what most people really end up keeping track of and knowing about is how much they pay in property tax if they own a house. Renters don't keep very good track of it, but rest assured, if you're renting, you're helping your landlord pay property tax. And what most people do really have a handle on is their personal income tax, right? But levels of government use all three of these taxations. Okay, so what about the expenditure side? Okay, so historically, there was this disagreement on the spending power of the national government, right? Um, right in the preamble of the Constitution, it talks about the common defense and general welfare. But what are those things, right? What do we mean by common defense and general welfare? A couple of students, you know, brought out the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution in last week's or a couple of weeks ago in discussion. Um, what does necessary and proper mean, and what really constitutes common defense and the general welfare? So historically, courts have sided with expansive spending, and even with that, though, until the New Deal era, national spending was usually fairly limited and started growing after that and World War II. Um, Federal government spending started growing. However, it started growing a lot more with the Great Society under President Johnson with Medicare and Medicaid. It started growing a lot then. The Constitution was written assuming states already had an idea of what they needed. This is why earlier in this lecture I said, states can pretty much define their own tax base. The Constitution really doesn't tell states how to define their tax base. So the assumption was, I think, they knew what they're doing. So here's kind of what the founders expected. I've used this chart a lot because I studied this. This happens to be a chart of the percent of the national budget, the federal budget, that was spent over, from the founding of the Republic through about 2011. This is what the founders would have expected, and one of the reasons they wrote in the Constitution that military funding should be limited to 2 years is it was twofold. One was to actually examine the budget, and the second was they really didn't know what kind of emergent wartime situations might pop up, and so they fully expected that from time to time the nation would have to fund a war, and they knew that would mean increasing military spending for the duration of that war, but they fully expected that spending then would decrease after a peaceful solution was found, right? And so this is really the history of what we've seen in the United States through World War II. So we see spikes at the War of 1812. We see a spike for the Mexican War. We see a very large spike at the Civil War, which is equal or even greater in percentage terms to the spike in World War II. So the Civil War and World War II are really good examples of how a major, really existential crisis like those two wars will consume almost the entire federal budget while that wartime event is going on. And so you see these spikes in the other wars as well. In Korea, you see a spike, but it's not as pronounced. But then look at Vietnam and the so-called buildup of the military under President Reagan, and then post 9/11. What you just see there are just little bumps. Why is that? Why is because this chart demonstrates the fallacy of using percentages of something to demonstrate buildups of costs. It wasn't that Korea and Vietnam and the Reagan buildup didn't cost very much. It is just that the budget was being expended on some other items that it wasn't being expended upon. So as a percentage, the military buildups didn't really cost that much. What's a better way to look at budgets is to examine the outlays and the revenue. These happen to be from Fred, the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, which we've talked about. They're really good. They have some really good charts. I really like their charts. So I have two charts from Fred here. This first one is outlays, which is just the amount of money that the federal government spends in a given year. And the second one is revenue or receipts. Okay, so look at outlays from 1930 on. So 1930, really in the dark days of the Great Depression. What this talks about is the outlays of the federal government compared to GDP. So here's what you see. In the darkest days of the Great Depression, around 1930, outlays of the federal government compared to national GDP was only about 4%. And that's really given the fact that actually GDP wasn't even very high. But as GDP grew, as we were coming out of the Great Depression, spending actually increased. So we see during the Depression, spending outlays as a percentage of GDP growing through the beginning of World War II. And then, of course, it shoots up during the war. So it goes up to 40%. So as opposed to about 90% of the federal budget going to the war effort, only about 40% of the as a percentage of GDP was going towards outlays. So there's the reason that's important is because GDP was also increasing during the war. We were manufacturing a heck of a lot. So 40% is still a large percentage because after the war it went down again to just over the 10% range. But here's what you see from about 1950 on. You see that trend line steadily increasing through the current day, whereby after about 1980 or so, in the late 1970s, the federal government consistently started spending in excess of 20% of GDP for outlay. So that 20% is something like a magical line. 20% is referred to in the Simpson-Bowles report of 2010, when Simpson-Bowles Commission actually looked at how to bring down federal deficits and federal debt. So 20% was referenced as sort of a baseline that outlays and receipts should equal. So we see that outlays have steadily stayed over 20% of GDP. But let's look at receipts. So receipts are really just revenues that the federal government's getting from various sources. Again, starting in 1930, right? As a percentage of GDP, the federal government was not getting that high a percentage in revenues and receipts. Well, in fact, as World War II started, the Congress decided to make income tax applicable to average wage earners. So about 65% of average wage earners in World War II were paying income tax. It was only about 10% or less before that. So revenues did increase along with expenditures during World War II, but then we kind of kept it that way. So what you see here on this chart is a trend line that doesn't go as pronounced in an upward direction as expenditures. And in fact, what you see here is that receipts or revenues have consistently stayed below that magic 20% line. So what does that mean? What that means in simple terms is that we're spending more than we're getting back in revenue. So the Simpson-Bowles report, again, of 2010, if you go back and look at that, what they tried to prescribe was lowering expenditures to that 20% line while trying to increase revenues to about that 20% line. And we haven't done that. We haven't done a very good job of that. Ergo, we have deficits spending, which lead to debt. So what is debt? So it's always important to differentiate debt and deficits, right? A deficit is a one-time event. At the end of the month, if you have an income, a monthly income of say $3,000, and you have monthly expenditures of $3,200, what does that mean? That means that you have a deficit, a $200 deficit. Well, how are you going to pay for that deficit? You're going to borrow money from somebody, right? So borrow money from a sibling or your parents or a bank or a credit card, you're going to incur debt. So debt, the incurring debt over time to pay off your deficit is what the U.S. debt is about. So always differentiate between our long-term debt and deficits. But as a percentage of GDP, this is what's been happening to our debt. So that's the blue line with the left-hand axis. Again, in World War II, we had a lot of debt, or post-World War II, we had a lot of debt, which we successfully started paying off. And it went down over time, but then it started coming back up again in the 80s and 90s to the point now where we have continual debt, right? So this chart, as opposed to page 80 in your book, in the Stenberg and Hamilton book, in the Posner article, this only projects through 2024, and so we see debt at plus 80% of GDP. I only put this chart in here from both these charts, actually 3 of these charts are from the Center for Responsible Federal Budgeting. I kind of want this chart is put in their article to alleviate a fear that people have that China owns all of the debt of the United States. It doesn't. Actually, a lot of countries own the debt of the United States. So Japan, China, the Eurozone, and other countries, as well as domestically, we own a lot of the debt of the United States, right? So mutual funds, S&Ls, households, a lot of the debt of the national government is owned by you and me, and then another big chunk of it is owned by the Federal Reserve, right? So when we say owns the debt, what that means is all those entities there, which includes individuals and countries and the Federal Reserve, are buying treasury instruments which are issued to make money to pay off national expenses of the United States. But there are also intergovernmental holdings, and this is important because this actually has to do with Social Security and other funds, other trust funds, retirement trust funds like civil service retirement, railroad retirement, military retirement, that are actually paid for by trust funds. How do these trust funds capitalize themselves? The way they actually do that is they buy treasury instruments. They're not the same kinds that investors buy. They are special instruments. So what this really means is that Social Security Trust Fund has bought debt from the United States government. So in real time, the Treasury is funding the Social Security. The debt part of the trust fund is really held in Social Security, in Treasury instruments. Okay, so how about the expenditure side? So here's what we see at the national level, right? 26% is healthcare. This has some intergovernmental implications because a lot of that, Medicare, Medicaid, is spent in the states. Medicare is different than Medicaid, of course. Medicare is actually going directly to the individuals. Medicaid does flow through the states. 24% is Social Security, as we know, and 16% is national defense. So my point here is that anytime anyone talks about, reducing the debt, as the Simpson-Bowles report did, which means reducing expenditure, it's really difficult to do that unless you start talking about reducing healthcare expenditures, reducing Social Security expenditures, and reducing national defense expenditures. Whatever your position on those things are, just simply those are the numbers. How about state spending? So this is from the Urban Institute, this chart, and this talks about what states generally spend their money on. So this doesn't include the money that states get from the federal government, which is about 30% of their overall budget, but just in their general budget, this is functionally how states spend their money. So about 22% is public welfare. A lot of that is their state Medicaid expense. And then there's elementary and secondary education, which is about 21%. And then higher education, health and hospitals, police and corrections, highways and roads. So, it's really hard to talk about the state level budget process unless you start talking about education. Anytime you talk about reducing state expenditures, there is going to be some kind of reduction to K-12 education and higher education because that's a large portion of what states spend their money on. This breaks that down a little more. This is from an organization called NASBO, the National Association of State Budget Officers. So look at those two circle diagrams, those two pie graphs, basically, one on the left says total state expenditures, the one on the right says state funds. So what's the difference? The total state expenditures is the entire budget. So the 2019 budget for Nebraska was just signed by the governor 27th of May. And so what the legislature passed there was a $9.3 billion budget. But not all that is state funds. Only maybe around 70% or less of that is state funds. The rest is coming from the federal government. So what you see in the total is about 30% of state budgets go for Medicaid, about 20% goes to K-12, and about 10% to higher education, and then you see all the others. So if you just talk about the amount that comes from the state funds, about 17% is Medicaid, and about 25% is K-12, with about 13% for higher education. So that's, that is really on average. So where does all the state revenue come from? And we talked about this a little bit. About 30% is from intergovernmental transfers. That means money from the federal government. And then we see how sales taxes, income taxes, charges break down, right? But this is at the state level, and this doesn't include property taxes, specifically because most of the property taxes, the bulk of property taxes, are charged at the local level. So if we talk about grants as being a big part of that 30%, we have to figure out what that means. So again, grants aren't free money. They almost always come with requirements. So some represent mandatory spending, and the bulk of that is Medicaid, right? And that's based on eligibility of individuals, and the states also have to fund that. Then some are based on specific functions, and those are categorical grants. So we might think of things like community-oriented policing at a police department. Some have general purposes, but provide discretion for the state or locality. So the greatest example of that is community development block grants, which cities of a certain size get, and they do have some discretion on how to spend that money. I mean, they can't spend it on candy bars, but there is some discretion. And then often the federal government just simply pays for a large portion of something a state runs, like the National Guard system, which the National Guard system is almost completely funded, in the 80 and 90% range by the Army and Air Force budgets. And the states pay not that much of that. And then often funding is provided for designated emergencies, like the flooding we just had. And so Congress is still arguing about, disaster relief for states and territories. And those kinds of things often require specific congressional authorization on how to spend that money. So a couple from the reading in the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities article in the supplemental readings. This is good. You could actually go to the reading itself and look at these. It talks about mandatory grants and discretionary grants. These are mandatory in the sense that they are run by formulas that have been previously approved by Congress, right? So Medicaid is a formulaic kind of program. And Congress doesn't vote Medicaid up and down year to year, nor does it vote the rest of these things up and down year to year. So a lot of these are mandatory spending. Sometimes the money flows through the states, and sometimes really it is actually directed at individuals. But then the article also talks about discretionary grants, and these are only discretionary in the sense that Congress can and does change the amount appropriated to these purposes each year. So, but the states also depend on this money. So I just wanted to do, as the last thing of this lecture, kind of a case study in accounting for grants in the city of Omaha. And so the reason I present this is because if you start looking at a city budget and you want to know how much money a city gets in grants, it's really hard to do. And if you go to that video from C-SPAN, you noticed that was being discussed there, that it was really difficult to understand how much money is being provided to cities in the form of grants. And I just want to give you a little demonstration of why that might be. So this is from the City of Omaha's website, and I put the link up there so you can go to this website. Here's the 2019 adopted budget, and you see on the page there that has all these tabs, A to G. And so you would think this is the entire budget for the City of Omaha. But here's how the city's broken down. They use a fund structure, and I think most of you are familiar with what a fund structure means from public budgeting class, that this is how political entities divide up the money that they're going to spend. So they have the general funds, special revenue funds, capital funds, etc. So a lot of the money, most of the money is in the general fund to pay for day-to-day expenses of the city. But then we have grant funds. So look at the second paragraph of the grant fund display. This is section C of the budget. It says grant monies financing programs in this section are not merged into other schedules appearing in the budget document with the exception of direct grant reimbursements to the participating city budget. Therefore, grant monies or grant receipts related to the programs are not reflected in schedules pertaining to the city's actual budget receipts. So this is interesting. What this means is that sometimes if there's a grant, you're not going to see it in the city's budget, but sometimes you will. And this makes it difficult to understand how much of the budget is coming from grants. So here's an example of the police budget. This is for 2019. So the Omaha Police Department, what you see there is on the top, you see they have appropriated, the city council has appropriated $164 million, almost $165 million for the police department, and they balance their expenditures and their source of funds perfectly, right? They say, they have 165 million in expenditures, and then the bottom part says source of funds, 165 million, and it shows where all those funds come from. Great, but look at the footnote at the bottom. Staff expenses and grant reimbursements are displayed within the budget. Refer to section C summary of the grants work paper for the grants included in the budget. So that was that previous thing that said grants aren't always included. Well, in this case, they are included, but what you have to do is, if you get a chance to do this, go through that section C of the budget to see the various grants that do apply to the police department. It's very interesting, but there is no document that specifically breaks down direct and indirect costs and how they're applied to the police budget. So again, that's a repeat of what that said, but so go through this document right here, section C, and you can see the grants that the city is using, part of which go to the police department budget. So just the last couple of slides here. Going back to that C-SPAN video in the supplemental readings, my point here is that tracking grants and contributions from federal sources to a city, it's not really an easy proposition for you to do if you're actually trying to figure it out. You have to spend some time going back and forth between documents. And why is this? One is, if you get into that section C document of the Omaha budget, you'll see that grants might vary year by year, and they might be multi-year in application. So the Department of Justice, for example, might award a grant to the Omaha Police Department, but it's multi-year in application. So the city is using some of the funds in one year, some of the funds in another year. Some grants might depend on the ability of a city to research and write. And in fact, that C-SPAN video talks about that, that a city with a lot of internal capacity to have a grants department, if you will, might actually get more than their fair share of grants. Third, budget exhibits at the local and state level are often biased towards the general fund, right? So at the state level and at the city level, you're going to see a lot of detail on the general fund. So you're going to be able to tie local tax revenues or state tax revenues to the general fund, and you're going to be fairly successful in doing that if that's what you're researching. However, if you're trying to break up grants into a level of detail, you might not be as successful, and your research project might be a little more difficult. And fourth, and finally, this is important, the street level bureaucrats, that's Michael Lipsky's term, who carry out the grants look the same, no matter where the pay comes from. So what I mean to say is that there are some police officers on the Omaha Police Force that are funded by federal grants. But if you line up 100 Omaha police officers in uniform, you are not going to be able to tell which one is funded by a federal grant. They might not even know themselves. So grant funds are really integrated and mixed into state and local budgets to such an extent that it becomes difficult actually to be able to differentiate between funding unless you are a budget expert. And so this leads to the discussion question for this week. And so what I'd like you to do is, based on the text and the readings, I'd like you to comment on at least two important ways that the grant process between the federal government, I say grant process, I really mean the funding process between the federal government and the state governments can be improved in the interest of making programs more effective to the policy purposes of the programs, and then use an example of that would help you illustrate that. So I'm looking forward to those discussions. Thanks a lot.